wrecking it, and it was housed in the remodeled. We remodeled the old horse barn and put in a large door with a sliding door so that the car could be housed. The garage became the horse barn became a garage. The car was equipped like all cars were at that time. This had a cloth top. The early cars did, and the had side curtains that had isinglass windows in it. And you put those on when it rained. It had a running board, which is very, very handy. It would be handy even today to have running boards on cars. And the spare tire was attached to the rear of the car. The car was used mostly for just for transportation, but it wasn't as used as much as your cars are today. People still primarily walked. Everybody walked. Kids walked to school. People walked to work. And go to school in those days, you just walked to school. You went around the high school. There were no cars around the high school like there are today. Everybody was walking. In the wintertime, that car was stored in the garage. It was put up on jacks to take the pressure off of the tires, because all tires at those days had inner tubes. And so that relieved the pressure, because you didn't use the car in the wintertime because the roads were not plowed. That didn't come until afterwards. The battery was taken out in the wintertime and stored in the house or in the basement. And in the springtime, it was put back in again to protect it from freezing. Another thing I recall about the old home on 3rd Street and Woodward Avenue was that it had an outside water system. There was a water cistern where rainwater was stored that came off the roof. This was a hole had been dug, and a large well-like affair or storage well was made on a cement block with a cement floor, and the ceiling was also made out of cement and steel rods, and it enclosed an area about 6 by 6 by 12, which if you transpose that, it amounted to approximately an area that would store about 3,000 gallons of water. And the water came off the roof into the valleys and into the gutters, and then a downspout was directed, and the water flowed into this underground system or cistern. And from there it was piped into the basement, and there that water was soft water. It made it much easier to do laundry because it required less soap, and it was rainwater. And rainwater, of course, was desired by women who did the laundry. And that cistern, I imagine, is still there. Of course, now whether it's filled with water or whether it's filled with gravel, I don't know. And I often wonder whether the people who own the house now know it's even there, because it was covered over, and it had a manhole cover. It was pretty good size, so that people could get down there in there if you had to go down in there. And but it was covered with grass and gravel, and you'd be surprised if you try to drive a stake in there sometime and hit that cement top. But that's another color. But that's where that was a cistern. Now, not every home had that. Not every home had that. Then I also thought about another thing that occurred during the summertime in Roger City. We talked about the various types of entertainment that they had, and we mentioned that there was the circus that used to come to town. There was the Chautauqua shows that came to town. These were 10 shows. And then there were the Kelly shows that came to town for pure entertainment. And then I remember on 2 occasions, we had what they called a medicine show that came into town. I'm sure you've all heard of the medicine shows that were part of Americana all over its history. This particular show was called the Tonal Show. And it set up a tent right where the City Hall now stands in Roger City. And it had entertainment of various kinds. It was a variety show. It had such things as tap dancers and singing, and clowns, and train dogs, people playing banjo, people playing guitars, you name it, they had it. Various types of entertainment. Now the key thing was this, that every time an act would be performed for probably about 10 minutes, then immediately after that, a spieler or talker would come out, and they would sell candy in little bags, and or gum, or other small artifacts that were for sale for usually about 5 or 10 cents. And they'd walk up and down the aisles, and you bought a bag of candy. The candy was usually what we'd call candy kisses. It was a little piece of a candy that was wrapped in a little folder. Now another thing that they had in between acts was that they sold a patent medicine. And this patent medicine of this particular show was called Tonal. Tone dash capital ALL, Tonal. And it was a situation which we'd call like Geritol or the other patent medicines that are sold for a variety of ailments. The key thing about this is that this was sold for about $1 a bottle. It was kind of a brown liquid thing. The bottle, I remember, was square and a very, very fancy label on it. And the spieler would spiel off and how great it was. It could cure practically anything. And he went on to mention such things. You could use it for the common cold. It was good for constipation, good for diarrhea, good for ulcers, rheumatism, and asthma, for sore toes, for falling hair, for obesity. It could help cure deafness and cataracts. You name it, and it was good for it. Now, I remember stuff is that this used to irritate the local doctors. Dr. William Arscott, who was our family doctor, told me afterwards that he wasn't so much objecting to the fact that they were selling a patent medicine because, after all, he said you could buy it in drugstores. But it was the fact that this guy would spiel out all the things that it could cure. Well, he said, it was nothing more than really, he said, as far as he could figure out, that a good cathartic. It was made out of about 20% alcohol, the rest of it was water, and there was a little flavoring from brown sugar, there was some flavoring from cascara, there was probably a touch of mint or wintergreen, and or other flavors. And the key thing here is that this stuff was bottled right in that tent in the late evenings. After the show, they would make up another batch of this stuff and put it together. Now, as he said, that this was just previous to Prohibition. You could buy alcohol. That is, that people could buy alcohol, and they could mix it or drink it any way that they wanted from the local drugstores, or they could buy it right from the bars, what we called saloons. But these people, of course, took that stuff. He said the key thing was it was about 20% alcohol. He said if you drank enough of it, he said you probably could get drunk. And but he said that the price for $1 was absolutely ridiculous, and that's what he was objecting to. He said that it didn't do much harm and it didn't do much good, but it left an impression that the spieler gave out that it was a cure, and he said that's what he objected to. But it was a part of pure Americana. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about one of my favorite subjects, and that is mother's cooking. All of us as kids, regardless of who we are, remember our mother's great cooking. Well, of course, that was compounded by the fact that we were young and we were hungry, and our appetites were very, very keen, and our taste buds were very, very keen, and Mother knew just how to use the right flavoring regardless of what family it came from, whether it was baked goods or cakes or cookies. Now, there are a few things that I recall and I often mention about was that our mother, Alma, was a great beef cook. She knew how to cook roast beef and brown gravy. And that, of course, as you remember, that along with potatoes. Potatoes and meat and gravy beef in our home was the great staple. Now, we also had other great things. We had things that I remember mostly. We had fried bread, and that was made with Mother's great wheat bread. Mother was a great wheat bread maker. Dad would go out and take wheat, take it to the mill, get it ground up, and that became the great staple of the house, as you remember, for many, many years. Wheat bread, bread and butter, or jam, and that, along with some of the other great foods that I recall, was goulash, the Hungarian goulash, and then there was the baked lake trout with dressing, and Mother was great at that. And then there was the home-smoked hams and bacon, which I had mentioned previously, that were made. Then there was another one I recall was the red tomato jam that Mother made, and the wonderful fish soup made with lake trout, and served with boiled potatoes and a little vinegar. Then there, of course, there was in the summertime, Dad loved to fish. He loved to fish trout, and he got a lot of them. And as you remember, from out the Trout River or Silver Creek or the Little Akiak, and we had a lot of good trout dinners. Turkey, as far as turkey was concerned, we had it at Thanksgiving and Christmas. At that time, now of course it's served anytime. We had a lot of salt herring that came in the cakes. And as a treat, occasionally we had raw chopped beef, which is a local specialty, made actually with raw beef. That beef was ground, and sometimes we made it there at home. I made it a couple times, but you would probably buy it from Hasenberg or Plath or Hilla, buy a pound or two for Christmas or some special occasion. This raw beef was ground several times, and then it was mixed with raw onion and salt and pepper. That's all that was ever in there. And it was served with crackers or thin bread, and boy, it is good. And it's a real epicure's dish, and the history goes way, way back into the history of Europe. It was served in the finest hotels and on the finest ships, and it was called beef tartar. You can still see it on some of the menus from the old days if you take a look at them. And it's still made. Here locally, it's still made practically almost every day by some of the Eskil and Alpena area. Other food items that I fondly recall were Mother's jelly roll cake, her wonderful coffee cake, which was flavored with ground cardamom. And then there was the stone bread, originally made only at Thanksgiving and Christmas, but now made all year round. And then I remember a few items that were made especially to satisfy Dad and to satisfy me. We would, Dad and I would go out to Lost Lake, where he had a good chunk of property, and immediately on the shore of the lake, there was an abundant supply of wild grapes. Sometimes they would be just there by the ton. We would go out and pick maybe 3 or 4 bushels of wild grapes, bring them back, wash them up, take out the stems, and then put them through a crusher or a presser and press out the juice. And Mother would make grape jelly, which was delicious. Another thing that Dad and I would do, we'd go out into the Metz area on certain branches of the Thunder Bay River and pick wild cranberry. Wild cranberry grew in high bushes there. Those bushes sometimes reached the highest of 8, 10, 12 feet. Bend down the branches and pick off these little red cranberries. They're about the size of a pea. And we did the same thing there. After we got a good supply of them, we brought them in, maybe we got a half bushel or something in that area, and then we bring them in and wash them. And there again, Mother would cook that, and then would run through a presser, and from that she made this wonderful jelly or syrup, which I loved on pancakes or waffles or just on bread with butter. Those are some of the treats that I remember. Now in our house, to remember something else, most of the meals, when the 6 of us kids were home, were eaten around the kitchen table. And we ate in the dining room on special occasions or for Sundays or when we had company, or if it was a birthday or Christmas or Thanksgiving, 4th of July or some special occasions, we would eat in the dining room. But most of the meals were eaten around the kitchen table, and during the course of the school year, that was the focal point where everything started. That's where you got your chance to speak, and you had your chance to say what you wanted to say. Everybody had a chance to talk. Dad would find out how were things going in math, how were things going in the first grade or the fourth grade or the sixth grade, and how's that algebra going, and so forth. And it was a place where you had a lot of conversation along with the food. Now, it just so happened that, as you probably will remember, there was a wonderful wooden bench that sat alongside the windows facing the east, facing Woodward Avenue or the Bertram House. That was a bench that was probably about 6 feet long and about 18 inches high and about 10 inches wide. It had been made by a carpenter, Mr. Conert, who helped do a lot of the finishing work in the house. And they built it originally as a place to sit and eat when they had their lunch. And the boards were available, so he just tapped this thing through together, and it stayed there for years and years and years. And as the young kids came along, including myself, that's where we sat. We sat on the bench. And it became I don't know who got the bench. I wish I did know. I wish they were using it, or if they have it and don't want it, I'll take it back. But it's interesting to note that that bench was made out of part of the big pine tree that Mother and Dad used to get lumber to help build the home. That was the story of the big pine is something I'll talk about again some other time. But that pine tree survived the Met's fire. It was over 100 foot tall, and it was over 6 foot at the base. And after the fire, Grandma and Grandpa Gramberg gave it to George and Alma for lumber to help build their home. They had a lot where the house now stands in Rogers City, but they had to accumulate lumber. The first thing they did about that thing, first before they built the house, they built the horse barn, so that if they had lumber, they could store it in there, and that's where that lumber was stored after that tree was cut down. But that's another story, and I'll talk about that later. And so that bench, however, was a part of the thing that I remember from the early days. Now, another thing I remember from the early days, you'll have to pardon the way this stuff is brought up, but as I say, I just talk about things as things come to mind. In the St. John's Lutheran Church that we attended here in Rogers City, in the early days, as I recall, I do know that all the sermon, that was called the German church, because the sermons were all in German in the early days. And it wasn't until I think about 1916 that Reverend Ross came and he introduced the first English into that congregation. He was also the man that started the St. John's Lutheran School, and he was the first teacher. He taught all grades from K through 8 in that building afterwards. But nevertheless, I remember from probably about age 5 going to St. John's Lutheran Church on Christmas Eve. The whole congregation would gather, and what was unique about this is this. Every church, of course, naturally had a Christmas tree. Not every did. I suppose they ever did. Most of the churches did that I ever knew about. This tree that we had at St. John's was in the old church, and up to a little bit to the left of as you face the church, to the left of the altar. And that tree was approximately maybe 12 or 15 feet high, maybe 12 feet high. Beautiful tree, and the unique thing about it is that they used real candles on real candle holders attached to the branches, and that tree probably had 50, 60, or 100 of these candles that were attached to it. On Christmas Eve, after the congregation got in there, a group of the men, equipped with long, high step ladders, would go up and light those candles. Now, immediately at the base of the tree was probably maybe 25 or 30 10-quart pails of water. And other men stood by, and they had wads of cotton attached to fish poles, like bamboo poles, maybe on 8, 10, or 12-foot poles. And those cotton balls, those wads of cotton were dipped with water. Everything was quiet. The lights were all lit. And for a period of probably about 2 minutes, the whole tree was aglow with this actual live candles. And after it was all lit, this was all quiet. Ordinarily, nobody said anything except maybe a few babies crying. They would sing Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, because this was a German service. Holy night, silent night, holy night. And it was just memorably beautiful. And after a candle burned down, about halfway, one of those wads of wet cotton would hit it, out it went. See, that was a very, very dangerous procedure, and they recognized it, and that lasted only a few years, and I guess reason triumphed over tradition, and they quit it. And they waited for the church to be electrified, which came soon afterwards, because it wasn't long after that electricity came into Rogers City. First, they had it at the plant. They built a power plant at the plant because they needed electricity down there. And then they had an excess of electricity. They sold it to the Rogers City Power Company, which was set up in Rogers City. It was set up on Woodward Avenue, immediately back of where Dr. Arscott built his house. Part of that building is still there. It was the Rogers City Power Company. And from there, they distributed power throughout the community. The home on 3rd Street there was, when we first moved in here, as I remember, we had kerosene light, just like they did in all the rest of the homes in town. And then electricity came in, and then the houses were wired one by one by electricians. Our house was wired by a man named Brooks. And he and a couple other fellows, they worked at the plant, and then after work and on Saturdays and Sundays, they went into these homes and wired the homes. And that's how it came. Now, it was easier, our house was a little bit easier at that time to do, simply because in the upstairs of that home, there was only one room upstairs, and that was the back bedroom. And before that, there was one great big hall up there. And so it was easy to get in there with wires, so that later on they could get to the ceiling and in between the wall areas to run the wires down, to run into the various rooms. And then, of course, later on, when the upstairs was finished off and the additional bedrooms were put in, and the back bedroom was remodeled and enlarged, that was up there, then, of course, they had electricity throughout the house. But all the places in Rogers City, of course, originally they ran kerosene, just like every other small community. And then later on, the rural areas got it. Along about the last part of the 30s, they started to electrify the rural areas. They got electricity on the farms. Before that, everything was man-powered or machinery, or they ran some of the stuff was run by motors, gasoline motors. But now, to get back to the church, they, as I say, that lasted only a short period of time. The candles, but that was a very, very impressive sight. But of course, I realize now that it was a very, very dangerous thing also to do. But of course, they had it pretty well guarded. As I say, they had just buckets and buckets and buckets of water in 10-quart pails or 12-quart pails that were stationed right there. And they only did it once, as I recall. Just Christmas Eve was the only time that they did that. They did then afterwards, then they decorated the tree. But they did not use any more, didn't light the candles anymore. They were just left on there. But we had them in our own home, that is in the home on 3rd Street. There were lighted candles. Not many, probably a dozen or two, maybe a dozen or 15, 20 lighted candles. And that was dangerous. And of course, every year there were, all over the country, there were a lot of fires that occurred at Christmas time because of candles on the trees. And some of those trees, of course, would just explode because they were so loaded with sap. And once a fire got going, it was a very, very dangerous thing. Another thing I remember about the neighborhood, and this would be true in a lot of small towns, was that everybody, of course, knew everybody else. And people watched out for each other's kids. If you got out of line in the neighborhood, even your neighbors would let you know, and also inform your parents at the same time. So you got your due. As far as discipline is concerned, you got double discipline. And the wrong was wrong, and that's all that there was to it. I got many strapping as a result of being out of line and the information coming by way of a family friend. Out of line meaning that you were probably smoking or swearing or fighting or taking apples or cherries or grapes from your neighbor's yard when you had plenty of your own. But they always seemed to taste better if they came out of your neighbor's yard. Everybody had a garden, of course. In most of the area where we lived in, everybody had fruit trees. But, as I say, they always tasted better coming from somebody else's yard. Now, also, I might say this, that in addition to many of the homes having horse barns, not every home had a horse barn, some homes, a good number of homes, had ice houses where ice would be stored in the wintertime and covered with sawdust. These were little homes, little buildings, probably 6 by 8 or 7 by 7 or 10 by 12, and ice was taken up in there in the wintertime and stored. The ice came out of Lake Huron. Some of it came out, a lot of it came out of Little Lake, and these people would cut it commercially, bring around, fill up your ice house, and then in the summertime you use that to cool drinks, or use it also to make ice cream. A lot of homes had ice cream makers. We didn't happen to have one, but I know there was one out on the farm, on the Metz farm, on the Grambua farm. They had ice house. Out of the Thunder Bay River or near Lusky's Dam, and they stored good quantities, and they used it in the summertime to make ice cream. And they had the regular ice cream makers, and whereas now in town you could buy ice cream. They had special ice cream parlors, which you still have a certain amount today. But ice cream was a little bit more of a treat than it is today. We used to have it at home at birthday parties and Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter, and but today, of course, it's a common food for almost every day. But in those days, a lot of people had these ice houses. I know the Yules next door to us had an ice house. C.H. Osgood, the banker, at the home which is now the manse for the Presbyterian Church, there was an ice house there. And you could go to any number of places in the community where they had an ice house. But of course, a lot of the ice came from right down there at the lake. And it was a common winter job. And of course, there were large quantities of ice that were put up at Little Lake, commercially ice. Usually the livery stable had ice houses down there where they would cut just tons and tons and tons of ice and put them into large buildings down there that were covered with sawdust, and that became the source of the Iceman. And that was, now here there was natural ice. In the cities, of course, they made ice commercially, and they still do. And so there was always call for cooling. Now we had a device in our home here on 3rd Street that we used as a cooler in the summertime, and it ran off of our flowing well in the basement. The temperature of the water coming out of the flowing well was probably around 50 degrees, and a box was built down there, which was a kind of a form of a chest, and there were a series of pipes that were in there, and on top of the pipe were pieces of tin, and that thing was closed off, and the water ran constantly. There was enough pressure coming from that flowing well, so that water circulated in there constantly, then drained out into the sewer line. And there you could keep your butter and your cream and other edibles that you didn't want to keep too long. Now it didn't freeze them, but it just kept them at a nice temperature, so that if you got a crock of butter, in the summertime you could keep the crock in there. You might probably bought your butter 2 or 3 pound crocks from the farmers, and then you kept it in there and kept it nice and sweet for a long period of time. Now I think probably I'd like to get into another area here that talk about for a few minutes, and that is in regard to hunting and fishing. Of course, as you probably know, I had a great love affair with hunting and fishing all my life. I started my love affair, you might say, with hunting at probably about age 5, when I persuaded my dad to take me along to go duck hunting at Swan Lake. Dad liked to hunt ducks, he liked to hunt rabbit, he liked to hunt partridge. He had made arrangements with a man by the name of Rieger to take him to Swan Lake to hunt ducks. Now, Swan Lake was located on plant property, went through the plant property, past the little lake, across the D&M tracks, and there was this lake in there, which is still there today, called Swan Lake, and it was well known for ducks. And this man, of course, hunted there frequently. So by the first time, it was probably 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, this man came along with his horse and buggy and a little dog, and also a small crate of 4 mallard ducks in a cage. We climbed into the device and took the horse and buggy down through the plant property. This took us, a good couple hours probably to get there. I don't remember, but it was maybe a distance of, maybe about 6 miles, I suppose. Maybe I think in that area there, somewhere in that area. And we went to Swan Lake, and we stopped at what's called the outlet of the lake, where Swan Lake empties into Swan River, and Swan River flows then for a period of probably a half mile into Lake Huron. At that point, the river was only about 6 inches deep at that time. So my dad carried me across there, and along comes this man with his dog and this crate, very, very light cedar crate, where he had these 4 mallards. Now, these mallards were tethered. They had their wings clipped, and so when we got along in a well-hidden blind, this man had hunted there, the blind was all set, and he took these decoys, live decoys, out and placed them in the water, probably about 15 yards offshore, and then he reached into his pocket and scattered some corn, whole kernel corn, and these mallards were in an area probably about, I would say 10 foot square. Well, with that food, they soon started to work. They started to tip up, go down and get that corn, and so they created quite a commotion. Well, we waited, and we could hear ducks quacking along the way. We could hear ducks moving in the air, but we had to wait until it got light enough. And sure enough, it didn't take long, and here comes a flock of ducks in. Well, the guns blazed away, and 5 ducks fell. And the dog immediately was out there. And they got one of them was just wounded, so it went across the lake. But my dad had a 12-gauge shotgun, single shot, and this man, Mr. Rieger, had a double barrel, 10-gauge, looked like a cannon. And that thing really, when that thing went off, it really boomed. You could really feel it in your ears. Well, we waited there, probably hunted for about an hour, and as I recall, we had between the two of them, they got a dozen ducks. These were good, great, big, fat mallards. Well, that was enough. That was some of the finest hunting that I'd ever seen. And Dad said afterwards it was the best hunting he ever had. And so we loaded back up, took the ride back to Rogers City. They whacked up the ducks. Well, each had, I think I remember, they each took 6. And so that was when I got bit. The duck hunting bit me right there. And afterwards, I went with Dad, of course, quite a few times. And then along about age 13, I got my own shotgun. And then proceeded from there on to hunt ducks all the rest of my life until a few years ago when I finally gave it up because it got too hard for me. But I hunted there, and I hunted with my good friend Lyman Polk and Earl Clee. For many, many years, we hunted at the Lost Lake. We hunted at Lake Nettie. We hunted at Clear Lake, the Barnhart Lakes. We hunted at Lake May and Akiak River. We hunted at the Seagull Point. We hunted along the shore of what they call the Huron Beach area now at the present time. And all over. But we also hunted on the Thunder Bay River, which flows into Alpena. These were river hunts. But I always enjoyed that sport. Later on, I got my own boat for a while and used to hunt a lot at Lost Lake where Dad owned land. And now I might say about that hunting business, that these ducks that this man placed there at that time, Mr. Rieger, that was legal at that time to use live decoys. It is no longer legal, but at that time it was legal to use it. And let's see here, I gotta get my notes. I got a couple notes here. Oh yeah, in addition to the duck hunting, of course, I hunted deer. I started to hunt deer about 1935, and I hunted with my grandfather Grambua's old 45-60 rifle, which I still have. And I remember that the first deer I got out of Lost Lake on the family property was the biggest deer I ever shot. Dressed and weighed 205 pounds and had 10 points. And I was hunting with Lyman Polk at the time. That rifle, which is still hanging here on my mantelpiece, I'm going to give to Bruce Grambua when I leave. I hunted deer for, approximately 35 years, from approximately 1935 to 1970. And in that period of time, I think I shot about 16 deer. I always enjoyed it as a sport. My first rifle, of course, was the old 45-60. Then I bought a 30-30 rifle. And at that time, Dad decided that he wanted to go deer hunting after he retired from he decided he wanted to go deer hunting. So he had Arnie, who was working in Detroit at that time, bought him a 348 Winchester rifle. And later on, Dad decided that 348 was a little bit too heavy for him, so we swapped. But I gave him $100 because what I had and what he had were two entirely different guns. But I came out all right. After I retired, I sold the gun for $350 to some collector. Now, I also like to say that in regard to fishing, I got the fishing bug about the same time that I got the hunting bug. Dad, of course, was an avid trout fisherman, a brook trout fisherman, and he loved to fish the small streams. That's what he learned to do as a kid. He fished the certain streams of the river, Thunder Bay River, which flowed into the Thunder Bay that when he was a kid had trout. He fished the upper Swan that had trout. And when he came to Rogers City, then he fished Trout River as well as the upper Trout River, along with Silver Creek and along with the little Akiak. He didn't care too much to fish the big Akiak. He liked to get in where he could crawl in the brush, as you say. He would often say that he knew how to handle it. He showed me how to handle the rod and how to fish trout, and what to use for hooks and lines and sinkers and things of that type, because that's what he had grown up with. He showed me how to fish the streams and where to fish. And he often said to me, he said, now, anybody can fish the easy part of a stream. And that's where you'll find most people fishing, where the fishing is easy. But he said, if you want trout, he said, go to the places on that creek where the other people don't want to go. It's too thick. There's too much brush. There's too much water. There's too much junk that you have to encounter. Too many logs that you have to crawl over. He said, that's where the fish are. And he was right, because he showed me in many instances, after we had crawled through heavy brush, there would be the creek. He showed me the techniques of presentation, and of using worms, of using spawn, and he said, remember, he said, you got to use a variety of bait. He said, give them what they want. Use salamanders, use bloodsuckers, use bees, use hornets, and he said grasshoppers. He said, take the natural food as much as you could possibly give it to them, give it to them in a variety of ways, and you'll catch fish. And he was right. Use feathers, use beetles, use salamanders, and small minnows, and insects. And he said, go where the greatest amount of mosquitoes are. He said, that's also where the greatest amount of fish are. He was a darn good teacher as far as instructing in hunting and fishing. And I guess it's from that I got a lot of my love of hunting and fishing, which is still with me today. And he said, you got to learn to discipline yourself when you fish. He said, keep quiet. He said, don't move any more than necessary. And don't talk unless you have to talk to somebody else. He said, talk in very quiet tones. He said, keep it as natural as you possibly can. Present your food, the hook as quietly as you possibly can. And he said, be patient. He said, think nothing of leaving your hook in a given hole. If you know there's fish in there, leave it in there for a half hour. Some curious one, and usually a good one, will come by. I fished not only brook trout, but I fished for brown trout, I fished for rainbow trout, and I've also fly fished. I learned how to fly fish from Aldi Long, who was an instructor here in the band department. He showed me how to tie flies, and he took me to some of the better streams for fly fishing, such as the sturgeon in the Wolverine area where he grew up, and also in certain areas around Manistee. And I fly fished for a few times on the Pier Marquette at Ludington and at Scottville, and always enjoyed it. Fishing is like a disease. You can never find the cure for it, except more fishing. Now, Marion became, I will say, a darn good wild game cook. She knew something about fish, frying fish from her mother, because Charlie Clausen, her stepfather, was a great fisherman for bass and for perch. So she knew something about frying fish, but she knew very little about game. And she became an excellent cook at duck and venison and rabbit and partridge. And she especially made a wonderful Hassenpfeffer, which is marinated rabbit. And she was actually fond of that herself. And she also made a wonderful marinated beef called Sauerbraten. That was really one of my favorites. And